Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a deep dive into a conflict that has, well, fundamentally reordered the Middle East's strategic landscape, the Israel-Iran war. This wasn't just another regional skirmish. It dramatically escalated into open warfare in 2024 and 2025, ripping away decades of what was once carefully managed as a shadow war.
That's right. And for you, the listener, our mission with this deep dive is to give you a real shortcut to becoming well-informed about this pivotal conflict. We've sifted through the sources to extract the most important insights, the surprising facts, and, help you understand not just what happened, but why it matters and what it means for the future.
We're going to journey through the war's surprising origins, its key phases, and its far-reaching, even global consequences. Our goal is for you to walk away with a comprehensive understanding of a conflict that, well, truly redefined the region.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What often surprises people is that Israel and Iran actually used to be strategic partners. How on earth did that come about? Yeah, it's truly fascinating how pragmatism shaped their early relationship. Iran was, remarkably, the second Muslim-majority country to actually recognize Israel as a sovereign state. This was a classic case of realpolitik, famously dubbed an alliance of the periphery, championed by Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion.
So a practical alliance, then. Not one built on any kind of, shared cultural affinity.
Precisely. Look, both nations faced a common formidable threat in the surging tide of pan-Arab nationalism sweeping the region, led by figures like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Right.
This shared strategic adversary fostered deep and surprisingly functional cooperation. It led to robust trade. Israel benefited from Iranian oil, for example, and Israeli technical and agricultural assistance flowed into Iran. Israel even maintained a permanent delegation in Tehran that effectively served as a de facto embassy.
A de facto embassy.
Yeah, for decades, long before formal ambassador exchanges happened, way back in the late 1970s.
But even during this period of surprising cooperation, you're telling me there were voices within Iran that were, let's say, deeply uneasy about this whole alliance.
Absolutely. Even then, undercurrents of dissent were bubbling beneath the surface. Islamist circles in Iran, including prominent figures who would later become central to the revolution, like Ayatollah Mahmoud Taleghani and Ruhollah Khomeini, were vocal critics of the Shah's ties with Israel.
Right.
They harbored deep sympathies for the Palestinian cause. Taleghani, for instance, actively raised funds for Palestinians after the 1967 Six-Day War, a conflict that dramatically expanded Israel's occupied territories and deepened the Palestinian refugee crisis. These simmering tensions certainly foreshadowed the dramatic, almost cataclysmic shift that was coming.
So if the Pahlavi era was this fragile bridge between two unlikely allies, then 1979 was, well, the dynamite. When the Iranian Revolution erupted, it wasn't just a change in government. It was a cataclysmic rupture that redefined their very existence. How fundamentally did this shift occur, and what did it mean for Israel?
What's truly striking is the sheer speed and symbolic weight of that change. Within days of the revolution, the new theocratic regime, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, immediately reframed Israel as an implacable ideological foe. This wasn't some minor foreign policy tweak. It became central to Iran's revolutionary identity and its entire foreign policy apparatus.
And what did that look like on the ground, practically speaking?
Well, Tehran cut off all diplomatic and commercial ties, withdrew recognition, and began referring to Israel exclusively as the Zionist regime, calling its territory occupied Palestine.
Wow.
And in perhaps the most powerful symbolic act, the Israeli embassy in Tehran was quite literally handed over to Yasser Arafat, the PLO chairman, who was actually the first foreign leader welcomed by revolutionary Iran. This move didn't just sever ties, it cemented Iran's new, uncompromising alignment.
So this was clearly more than just politics then. It sounds like an ideological crusade. But, even in a crusade, aren't there always pragmatic undertones? Was this truly just a little Satan theological declaration? Or was there always a clear strategic gain for Iran in adopting such a hardline stance?
That's a crucial question. While Khomeini certainly designated Israel the little Satan, second only to the great Satan, the United States, positioning it as an existential and theological opposition with open calls for its destruction. It wasn't just religious fervor. It was also a shrewd strategic instrument. By positioning itself as the ultimate champion of the Palestinian cause, Iran sought to project its influence and revolutionary ideology across the Arab world. This uncompromising stance was designed to transcend the historical Persian Arab and Shia-Sunni divides, allowing Iran to build surprising alliances even with Sunni groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It was a common cause that, effectively papered over deep ethnic and sectarian differences, building a pretty formidable regional network.
Right. So, for decades after that revolution, this conflict simmered, largely out of the public eye. It's often called a shadow war. How would you describe the defining characteristics of that period?
This era was defined by clandestine violence, a carefully orchestrated dance, really, that allowed both sides to inflict damage while maintaining a veneer of deniability and, crucially, avoiding direct state-on-state warfare. It involved proxies, assassinations, sabotage, and increasingly sophisticated cyber warfare.
Now, this next point is truly astonishing. I mean, it just flies in the face of everything we think we know about this relationship. Despite decades of public hostility, the Khomeini regime actually accepted covert Israeli military assistance during the brutal Iran-Iraq War. How on earth did that happen? What was the logic?
It's an incredible historical anomaly, isn't it? Look, facing an existential threat from Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Iran covertly received Israeli-supplied weaponry and even military instruction. And in a move that underscored the enduring logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Israel even bombed and destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981. That was the facility central to Saddam's nuclear ambitions. This provided direct, albeit secret, support to Iran's war effort at a really critical time.
While that surprising anomaly offers a glimpse into some forgotten pragmatism, it was ultimately an aberration, right? The defining characteristic of this shadow war for decades really remained Iran's relentless focus on building something far more enduring, its vast proxy network. Let's get into what that entailed.
That's right. The core strategy of this era was Iran's cultivation of the axis of resistance. This network, which included Hezbollah, established with IRGC help after the '82 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, as well as groups like Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, and various Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, while it was used to execute attacks.
Like what kind of attacks?
These included the devastating 1983 Israeli military headquarters bombing in Lebanon and the 1992 and 1994 Buenos Aires bombings targeting the Israeli embassy and a Jewish community center. It really demonstrated Iran's long reach.
And Israel waged its own intense counter-shadow war. What did that look like?
Well, Israel aimed to degrade Iran's military and perhaps most critically, its nuclear program. This involved a series of targeted assassinations of high-profile Iranian nuclear scientists like Mustafa Ahmadi Roshan back in 2012 and Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in 2021.
Right, I remember those.
And the conflict also expanded dramatically into the digital realm. Think about attacks like the 2010 Stuxnet virus on Natanz, which caused actual physical damage to centrifuges that was a landmark, really, marking the first publicly known cyber attack on industrial machinery. Iran, in turn, developed its own cyber capabilities, even attempting a pretty disruptive attack on Israeli water infrastructure in 2020.
So this was a high-stakes intelligence battle, often unfolding in the dark, completely unseen.
Absolutely. This was exemplified by Mossad's audacious 2018 theft of Iran's secret nuclear archive from a heavily guarded warehouse near Tehran. That suggested deep infiltration and serious intelligence capabilities.
Incredible.
And more recently, the 2024 paver attacks against Hezbollah members were described by analysts as a masterclass in this new form of warfare, seamlessly blending cyber infiltration of a supply chain, human intelligence, and remote strikes.
A true masterclass, as you said. It almost sounds like something out of a spy novel, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When you look at these operations, what does it tell you about the sheer sophistication and the sheer audacity of this unseen conflict?
Yeah.
And how did all this constant back and forth ultimately lead to an escalatory spiral?
It truly does. The sophistication is frankly terrifying. And what became clear is that each successful operation, each seemingly contained attack, just normalized a greater level of aggression. It steadily eroded the unwritten rules that had, for decades, kind of kept the conflict contained within the shadows.
Right.
So the April 2024 Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus wasn't totally out of the blue. It was a logical, if brutal, culmination of this trend. And Iran's subsequent direct missile barrage on Israel in retaliation for that strike. That irrevocably broke the tacit rules of the shadow war, setting the stage for the open conflict everyone had worked so hard to avoid for so long.
Okay, let's talk about Iran's forward defense doctrine. It relied heavily on this regional proxy network, the axis of resistance. But when push came to shove, how did that formidable shield suddenly shatter?
Well, this doctrine was designed first and foremost to keep conflict off Iranian soil. The axis of resistance was both a power projection tool and a deterrent. The idea was to unleash a ring of fire of rockets and missiles. Hezbollah alone had an estimated 150,000 projectiles if Iran was directly attacked.
150,000. Wow.
Yeah. The goal was basically to drown any Israeli offensive in a flood of simultaneous regional attacks.
So what was the catalyst that started its unraveling? How did this carefully constructed defense just fall apart?
What's truly ironic, in a way, is that the Hamas-led attack on October 7, 2023, while obviously disastrous for Israel, inadvertently provided Israel with the justification and, frankly, the international latitude for a massive and sustained campaign against the entire Iranian proxy network. This response unfolded across multiple fronts, systematically degrading the axis piece by piece.
How did that degradation play out specifically?
Well, first, there was the devastating degradation of Hezbollah. In response to Hezbollah's relentless cross-border attacks, Israel launched a full-scale war in southern Lebanon in late 2024. This campaign destroyed much of Hezbollah's military infrastructure and, critically, culminated in the assassination of its charismatic leader, Hassan Nasrallah, on September 27, 2024, followed by other top commanders. That was a decapitation blow, plain and simple.
And then a truly strategic catastrophe occurred for Iran in Syria. What happened there?
Indeed. In December 2024, the Assad regime in Syria, a key Iranian ally for decades, collapsed. This was a critical blow for Iran because it severed their vital land corridor for supplying advanced weaponry, including those precision-guided munitions, to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So a weakened Hezbollah was then left logistically isolated, essentially unable to be easily resupplied by its patron.
And Israel didn't stop there. They went after the leadership itself, both within Hamas and the IRGC, right?
Yes, absolutely. Israel systematically eliminated senior Hamas leaders like Ismail Haniyeh, killed in Tehran no less, in July 2024, and Yahya Sinwar in Gaza in October 2024. Israeli strikes also reached deep into Iran's own command structure, killing senior IRGC generals coordinating the Axis, including those in the Damascus consulate strike, and later, reportedly, even the head of the Quds Force, Ismail Ghani, and the chief of staff of Iran's armed forces, Mohammad Bagheri. This created a severe command and control vacuum across the entire network, a genuine paralysis at the top.
So fast forward to 2025. When Israel launched its direct military campaign, where was this much vaunted axis of resistance? It had been built up for decades to be this formidable deterrent. What happened?
The response was, as analysts described it, a deafening silence. The network, designed as Iran's first line of defense, remained conspicuously on the sidelines. It appeared, frankly, unable or unwilling to support its patron in any meaningful way.
Why the silence? What stopped them from unleashing that promised ring of fire?
Well, several factors converged. Hezbollah was, as we said, decimated by its war with Israel and simply lacked the capacity to open a major second front. The Houthis and Iraqi militias, while having weathered some U.S. airstrikes, largely lacked the strategic deep strike capability to significantly alter the course of this central conflict playing out on Iranian soil. There was also growing public discontent in these proxy states, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, over being dragged into a wider war for Tehran's agenda. People were getting tired of it. But perhaps most importantly, Tehran itself appeared highly sensitive to direct warnings from the United States. Iranian leaders understood, it seems, that unleashing their remaining weakened proxies against U.S. targets in the region would likely provoke a much more extensive American military intervention, an outcome the regime desperately sought to avoid. This led to strategic paralysis for the proxies. They were caught between a weakened capability and a very cautious patron.
So what does the collapse of this forward defense doctrine mean for you, the listener, and for Iran's future strategy? What are the big takeaways here?
Look, it represents a fundamental crisis for Iran's national security. It forced Iran into a direct state-on-state war against a militarily superior adversary, exposing its own soil to attack for the first time in a generation. This strategic failure will inevitably compel Iran to fundamentally reassess its security architecture.
So less reliance on proxies.
Exactly. The reliance on proxies has proven to be a flawed shield. This reality suggests a future strategic shift away from non-state actors and towards strengthening indigenous capabilities, things like ballistic missiles, advanced drones, air defense systems, and most critically, the pursuit of a nuclear deterrent as perhaps the only remaining credible guarantee against a future attack. It's a profound strategic pivot in the making.
Right. We've seen how the shadow war escalated and how Iran's proxy shield crumbled, but how did this actually erupt into full-scale direct conflict? Let's trace the key moments that really broke the old rules.
Okay. This period was characterized by the systematic breaking of previously held taboos, with each side raising the stakes in ways previously, well, unimaginable. It really kicked off on April 1st, 2024, with that Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consulate complex in Damascus, Syria.
Right, the consulate strike.
That strike killed 16 people, including 2 senior IRGC generals. From Iran's perspective, it was an intolerable violation of its sovereignty and a direct attack on its state apparatus.
And Iran's response broke a major, decades-old taboo itself.
It absolutely did. On April 13-14, 2024, Iran launched its first ever direct attack on Israel from its own soil. Over 300 drones and missiles in what they called Operation True Promise. However, from a purely military standpoint, this was largely a tactical failure.
Why a failure?
Because a formidable defensive coalition, Israel, the US, UK, France, even Jordan, intercepted 99% of the projectiles. It was a massive show of force, yes, but militarily pretty ineffective.
And Israel's response was calibrated, it seemed, designed to avoid full-scale war at that point.
Yes, initially. On April 19th, 2024, Israel conducted a limited retaliatory strike near an air defense radar system in Isfahan, notably close to the Natanz nuclear site. This was clearly designed to demonstrate capability, we can reach you, without pushing for full escalation. Both sides then appeared to step back for a moment, a kind of tense pause.
But that calm was short-lived. The autumn brought renewed and far more dangerous escalation.
That's right. The trigger seemed to be a series of high-profile Israeli assassinations that Iran felt it couldn't ignore. On July 34th, 2024, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran.
In Tehran itself.
Tehran. Then, on September 27, 2024, Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah was killed by an Israeli airstrike in Beirut. These were direct hits on Iran's network and its influence.
And Iran responded with greater force this time, suggesting the rules were truly off the table now.
Indeed. On October 1st, 2024, Iran launched a second, larger direct missile attack on Israel, firing over 180 ballistic missiles. This time, some did penetrate Israeli defenses, causing damage to military and civilian sites. Israel's response on October 26, 2024, was its first openly acknowledged strike on Iranian soil. Multiple waves of airstrikes targeted missile and drone manufacturing sites and air defenses near Tehran. This decisively abandoned any pretense of the shadow war. It was now overt, state-on-state confrontation. No more shadows.
This brings us to a major escalation point, Israel's Operation Rising Lion. What was the scope of this operation, and what was its overarching goal?
Right. On June 13th, 2025, Israel launched this major, sustained offensive. The stated aim was to dismantle Iran's capacity to threaten Israel directly. It was initiated shortly after the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, declared Iran had violated its nuclear obligations, which provided a kind of international pretext for Israel's actions.
And what were the stated objectives of such a massive undertaking? What did they hope to achieve?
Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated 3 core objectives. First, to dismantle Iran's nuclear program. Second, to destroy its ballistic missile capabilities. And third, to dismantle its terror axis of proxies. The tactics involved blistering attacks across Iran using warplanes and even drones that had reportedly been pre-smuggled into the country. These targeted critical nuclear facilities like Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, as well as military bases, missile factories, and key energy infrastructure.
But even with that intense campaign, there were inherent limits, weren't there? Limits to what Israel's air power alone could achieve against, say, deeply buried sites.
That's absolutely true. While surface facilities were heavily damaged, experts acknowledged that conventional air power alone couldn't fully eliminate deeply buried sites like Fordo. And that's why the conflict reached its most dangerous point, drawing in the United States directly.
Okay, how did that happen, and why did the U.S. decide to get involved in such a direct way, crossing that threshold?
Well, on June 22, 2025, U.S. bombers used specialized GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, MOPs, or bunker busters. This is a capability Israel simply didn't possess. They used these to strike deeply buried Iranian nuclear sites, particularly the Fordo facility, but also reportedly hitting targets at Natanz and Isfahan again. This was seen, it seems, as a strategic necessity for neutralizing Iran's most protected nuclear elements, the ones that Israel's own conventional bombs just couldn't reach.
And Iran's response was swift, bringing the world, it felt like, to the brink.
It was. Iran retaliated by firing missiles at the U.S. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. This direct U.S.-Iran exchange immediately triggered urgent, high-level ceasefire talks. Within hours, President Trump announced a complete and total ceasefire, referring to it somewhat dramatically as the 12-day war.
So, reflecting on this rapid and dangerous arc of escalation, what does this all mean for you, the listener? What should we take away from this?
Well, this whole arc reveals profound strategic miscalculations, arguably on both sides. Iran likely believed its direct retaliation back in April 2024 would reestablish deterrence. Instead, it broke a taboo, legitimizing direct Israeli strikes on its soil and shattering the illusion of its own inviolability.
And for Israel.
And for Israel, while their strikes certainly crippled Iran's immediate capabilities, they may have, perhaps counterintuitively, cemented Tehran's long-term resolve to acquire a nuclear deterrent. It could be seen as a tactical victory with a potentially potent strategic boomerang effect down the line. And critically, it drew its most important ally, the United States, into a direct conflict that Washington had spent decades trying very hard to avoid.
Right. At the heart of this entire conflict, really, is the nuclear question. Iran's ambitions versus Israel's long-standing policy of ambiguity. How does this intricate dynamic fuel the fire?
This creates a uniquely volatile standoff. The threat of proliferation and the complex calculations of deterrence have truly driven both nations towards open warfare. Now, Iran's official position has always been that its nuclear activities are solely for peaceful purposes. But Western intelligence and the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, have long suspected a military dimension. This suspicion was pretty much solidified by the 2002 revelation of the secret Natanz facility.
And Iran's program has advanced significantly since then, especially after the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, fell apart.
It has, significantly. After the 2018 U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, Iran openly breached the deal's enrichment limits. They reached 60% purity by April 2021, which, to put it simply for you, is technically just a few steps shy of weapons-grade material. Now, weaponization itself is a much more complex endeavor. It goes way beyond just enrichment levels, but that 60% mark was a major threshold. The IAEA censure in June 2025, citing a lack of transparency and cooperation, then provided the immediate international pretext for Israel's Operation Rising Lion.
What were the key nuclear sites targeted in those recent strikes, and how effective do we think they actually were?
Well, they included Natanz and Fordo. Those are Iran's primary uranium enrichment facilities. Isfahan, which houses a uranium conversion facility, and Alak, which was designed to be a heavy water reactor, providing a potential plutonium pathway to a bomb. While the strikes caused significant damage, reportedly delaying Iran's breakout potential by years, the crucial knowledge, the expertise, and likely much of the nuclear material survived.
So the threat isn't gone.
Not at all. And the attacks may have, in a strange twist, given Tehran the most compelling argument, as some analysts put it, to finally make the decision to build a weapon, feeling their conventional deterrence has clearly failed.
How does Israel's own nuclear status play into this, especially given their unique policy of ambiguity?
Right. Israel is widely believed to be the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East, yet it never officially confirms or denies it. This policy, known as amimut, or ambiguity, was established way back by Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion.
What's the strategic purpose behind maintaining that silence for so long? Why not just admit it?
Well, it serves several strategic purposes. It's meant to deter existential threats without explicitly triggering a regional arms race, or inviting preemptive attacks, or subjecting Israel to NPT inspections. That's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel hasn't signed. It's seen as a last resort capability, with experts estimating Israel possesses somewhere between 80 and 200 warheads.
So from Iran's perspective, it must feel like a clear strategic asymmetry and, well, a double standard.
That's certainly how Iran frames it. They're held to strict non-proliferation rules, while their main adversary possesses an uninspected arsenal with, effectively, impunity. Israel, conversely, views an Iranian regime openly calling for its destruction, acquiring a bomb, as an intolerable existential threat. This fundamental disagreement, this clash of perspectives, is really the core of their nuclear standoff.
This raises an important and frankly terrifying question.
Mm-hmm.
What about the risk of striking active nuclear sites? This isn't like hitting an empty warehouse or a reactor under construction.
This is a critical new variable in the equation, what some call the fallout factor. Unlike past strikes on pre-operational reactors, think Iraq in '81, Syria in 2007, Iran's key facilities like Natanz and Fordo are active and operational.
So what are the specific terrifying risks involved if you hit those?
Well, striking an operational reactor like Bushehr could potentially cause a meltdown and widespread radioactive contamination with devastating cross-border consequences. That's the nightmare scenario. Now, enrichment and conversion facilities like Natanz and Isfahan pose primarily chemical risks from materials like uranium hexafluoride gas. Dangerous, yes, but more localized. However, the deeply buried Fordo facility still requires incredibly powerful munitions like those U.S. massive ordnance penetrators. Using such weapons really pushes the limits of how much damage can be inflicted without causing broader, unintended environmental consequences.
So what does this fallout factor mean for you, the listener, in understanding the military planning behind these attacks? How does it shape decisions?
This contamination risk has clearly influenced military planners. It likely favors sabotage or special forces operations, which carry the least environmental risk, as a preferred first resort, if feasible. It also helps explain the careful, phased nature of the air attacks we saw and the intense post-strike monitoring by the IAEA. This fallout factor is now defining the practical limits of what military force can achieve in dismantling a mature and dispersed nuclear program. It's effectively drawing a new kind of red line in military planning, a constraint dictated not just by politics, but by physics and the potential for environmental catastrophe.
Okay, this war didn't happen in a vacuum, obviously. Major global and regional powers were maneuvering, protecting their interests, and in some cases, maybe finding new opportunities. Who were the key players on the international chessboard, and what were their stakes?
Absolutely. The responses of the United States, Russia, and China in particular have been pivotal. Their actions turned what could have been just a regional war into a real stress test for the international order and revealed some shifting alliances and priorities.
Let's start with the United States. Their role seemed to evolve dramatically, didn't it? From supporting partner to direct combatant.
It really did. The U.S. evolved from providing intelligence and crucial air defense support to Israel back in April 2024. Remember that formidable defensive coalition that intercepted Iran's initial barrage, and initially urging restraint, urging Israel not to retaliate too strongly. But the calculus shifted dramatically during Operation Rising Lion.
When they used the bunker busters?
Exactly. The U.S. launched direct strikes on Iran's hardened nuclear sites in June 2025. Because, frankly, Israeli air power alone was deemed insufficient to achieve the objective of neutralizing those deep facilities. The overriding U.S. interest was preventing a nuclear Iran and upholding Israeli security, but ultimately they failed to avoid direct war, something Washington had spent decades trying very carefully to prevent.
What about the Russian Federation? Their stance seemed a bit more complex, almost a calculus of opportunity and risk, as you put it earlier.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Russia officially condemned the Israeli strikes and called for de-escalation, even offering to mediate. But despite a supposed strategic partnership with Iran, Moscow provided no direct military support during the actual fighting.
So what was in it for them?
Well, the war actually brought them significant economic windfall through higher oil prices, which directly helped fund their ongoing war effort in Ukraine. Plus, it provided a valuable geopolitical distraction, diverting Western attention and resources away from Ukraine. However, Russia also has a core interest in preventing nuclear chaos right on its southern border, avoiding broader regional instability, and preserving the Iranian regime as a counterweight to the West, but critically, without being drawn into defending it militarily. A balancing act.
And the People's Republic of China, how did they navigate this crisis? They seem to prioritize stability above all else usually.
China maintained a stance of cautious neutrality. They called for de-escalation, condemned the strikes, and emphasized diplomacy. But their actual support for Iran was, as some noted, notably underwhelming. Mostly diplomatic rhetoric rather than any tangible aid. China's primary interests here are energy security. They rely heavily on Middle East oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz and protecting their vast economic investments, like their Belt and Road Initiative projects, all of which are undermined by regional war. However, the conflict also presented a strategic opportunity for them.
An opportunity for what, exactly? How do they benefit?
Well, it allowed China to criticize the U.S.-led security order as a source of instability in the region and to promote its own vision for global governance, like its Global Security Initiative, positioning itself as a more responsible peacemaker. While they offered to mediate, it's unlikely Israel would accept them as a truly neutral arbiter, given their strong ties to Iran. So they gained some diplomatic leverage without taking on significant risk or responsibility.
And what about the key regional powers, especially the Gulf states? How did they react to this war erupting basically on their doorstep?
The Gulf states think Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, their main goal was to de-escalate and, above all, avoid being caught in the crossfire. They reportedly provided some intelligence to Israel on Iranian strikes, a very quiet act of cooperation reflecting shared concerns, but publicly they called for restraint and stability. Qatar, in particular, played a crucial mediating role, constantly trying to de-escalate tensions behind the scenes. Their primary interest was maintaining regional stability and avoiding any direct involvement.
Pakistan, they share a border with Iran.
Right. Pakistan, which shares a long and sometimes volatile border with Iran, maintained what it called strategic clarity. They supported Iran's right to self-defense, but firmly denied providing any nuclear assistance, carefully balancing its ties with the U.S. and the Gulf states. Their main concerns were border stability and nuclear non-proliferation in the region.
So let's talk about the bottom line. What were the actual costs of this conflict, both economically and, more importantly, in human terms?
The consequences have been severe, sending shockwaves far beyond the immediate region. The most immediate global impact was, predictably, on energy markets. The conflict introduced a significant $10 per barrel risk premium into global oil prices almost immediately. Brent crude, the international benchmark, surged 8% right after the initial Israeli strikes, reflecting intense market anxiety.
And the constant fear, the elephant in the room, was always the Strait of Hormuz being disrupted.
That's right. That was the central fear. The potential closure of this vital choke point, through which something like 20% of the world's petroleum and LNG passes every single day. Analysts at JP Morgan assessed a full closure could drive oil prices beyond $130 per barrel. Even a partial disruption could easily push them to $90. This uncertainty led to immediate spikes in shipping and insurance costs, with tanker rates in high-risk areas surging by as much as 60%.
And what does that mean for you, the listener, and the global economy? How does that translate?
Well, these rising energy costs directly fueled global inflationary pressures. The International Monetary Fund estimates that for every 10% increase in oil prices, global inflation rises by nearly 0.4%. This raised very real fears of a severe global recession or potentially even a depression if the strait actually closed and economic activity ground to a halt. It truly demonstrates the fragility of the global economy, how a regional conflict can instantly ripple across the world and affect everyone's cost of living.
Beyond the economics, what was the human cost?
Mhm.
You mentioned civilians bearing the brunt earlier. Can you elaborate on that?
The humanitarian toll has been truly severe, with civilians in both Iran and Israel bearing the brunt. In Iran, as of June 19, 2025, reports indicated 224 people had been killed and over 2,500 injured by the Israeli strikes on over 100 sites, including major cities like Tehran. And tragically, reports suggested around 90% of those victims were civilians.
Just devastating.
It is. And beyond the grim statistics, you have to imagine the daily terror for civilians. Families racing through gridlocked Tehran, desperate to flee bombardment, compounded by fuel shortages, internet blackouts that severed communication with loved ones, and the stark reality of inadequate public bomb shelters in many areas. For many, this wasn't just about displacement. It was a profound loss of security and normalcy, etching deep psychological scars that will likely span generations.
And on the Israeli side, what was the impact there?
In Israel, as of that same date, June 19, 2025, 24 people were reported killed and 915 injured by the Iranian attacks. Again, mostly civilians caught in the crossfire. Damage occurred to homes, critical infrastructure, and even strategic sites like the Weizmann Institute of Science and the Bazan petrochemical complex near Haifa. Waves of missiles forced Israelis across the country into bomb shelters, causing widespread displacement and major disruption to daily life.
And the spillover into the broader region, it wasn't just contained to Iran and Israel, was it?
No, not at all. Debris from intercepted missiles fell over populated areas in Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, sowing fear and uncertainty there as well. And the war just exacerbated instability in a region already hosting millions of refugees. Iran itself hosts around 3.5 million, mostly Afghans fleeing the Taliban. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees warned repeatedly that the region simply couldn't afford another major refugee crisis, highlighting the potential for generational consequences. The UN Secretary General repeatedly warned of a catastrophic crisis that could ignite a fire that no one can control.
This deep dive reveals a truly fundamental shift, as we said at the start. This ceasefire, this 12-day war, might have paused the fighting. But what's next for the Middle East? What do the experts say are the most likely scenarios moving forward from here?
Yeah, the day after is definitely not a return to the status quo ante. It's very much the beginning of a new, arguably more dangerous chapter. Broadly speaking, there are three primary scenarios that analysts are debating for what could unfold next.
Okay, what's the most probable, in your view, or based on what analysts are saying?
Well, the most likely seems to be Scenario A, a tenuous ceasefire and protracted shadow war. Basically, the direct state-on-state attacks would cease, but clandestine operations, sabotage, assassinations, cyberattacks would intensify significantly on both sides. Iran would likely accelerate its nuclear program, perhaps more covertly now, and focus on rebuilding asymmetrical capabilities, viewing them as essential after the failure of their proxy shield. Israel, in turn, would continue its strategy of mowing the grass with targeted strikes to prevent nuclear breakout and degrade capabilities. For you, the listener, this means persistent economic headwinds for the global economy, as the risk premium for oil and shipping would likely remain elevated due to the ongoing tension.
And the worst-case scenario, the one everyone dreads.
That's scenario B, a wider regional conflagration. In this scenario, the ceasefire collapses entirely. A major Iranian retaliation for the strikes, or perhaps an Israeli preemptive strike based on new intelligence, could expand the conflict geographically. This could reactivate the remaining proxies, potentially draw in Gulf states directly, and possibly even lead to further U.S. involvement. This would be economically catastrophic, almost certainly leading to a global energy crisis, hyperinflation, and a severe global recession or even depression. That's the nightmare scenario.
Is there an optimistic path? Is there a negotiated off-ramp possible for this increasingly volatile region?
There is, conceptually at least, that's scenario C, a negotiated off-ramp. But it's optimistic and incredibly difficult, requiring unprecedented diplomatic heavy lifting from all sides. This would involve robust, multilateral diplomacy, likely involving the U.S., Europe, Russia, China, and key regional players. Key elements would have to include a revived and much stronger nuclear agreement with truly verifiable constraints on Iran's program, alongside an international framework to somehow curtail Iran's support for proxies. Crucially, it would require an inclusive regional security dialogue.
Bringing everyone to the table, even Iran and Israel.
Exactly. It would need to bring together Israel, Iran, and the key Arab states to establish confidence-building measures, maybe even work towards a long-term goal, like a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. Fundamentally, it's about rebuilding trust where none currently exists. Very, very difficult.
And regardless of which scenario plays out in the immediate future, what are the major long-term strategic implications of this war? What has already fundamentally changed for the entire global order?
Right. Several things are already clear. We've seen the definitive end, really, of Iran's forward defense doctrine based on proxies. That strategy failed. Crucially, there's the hardening of Iran's resolve, it seems, to acquire a nuclear weapon. They likely view it now as a strategic necessity, the ultimate guarantee, after their conventional vulnerabilities were so starkly exposed. This could very well trigger a dangerous regional nuclear arms race, with countries like Saudi Arabia potentially reconsidering their own options.
What else?
We've also seen a recalibration of regional alliances. There's likely to be deepening cooperation between Israel and key Sunni Arab states, driven by that shared Iranian threat, a sort of reverse periphery doctrine, as some call it. And finally, this whole episode poses a grave challenge to the global nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime, the NPT. You have Israel, a non-signatory with presumed nuclear weapons, attacking the nuclear program of an NPT signatory, Iran, however problematic Iran's compliance has been. That raises very difficult questions for international law and non-proliferation efforts worldwide.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, consider this. The immediate fighting may be halted, for now, but the strategic dynamics unleashed by this war have created a future of heightened tension and the ever-present risk of a catastrophic, potentially even nuclear conflict down the road. The question left hanging is, what level of sustained, creative, and perhaps even uncomfortable diplomacy will it truly take to prevent that terrifying future from unfolding?